morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rich Clark and I've been a hypnotherapist for the last 8 years and I've been a holistic therapist for the last 14 years. So this week I'm talking about discrimination for Truthful Tuesday. These are going to be released, but they're also going to be released during the week with little shorts. So I've already mentioned about classism being the first discrimination. I'm going to talk about the next one, which I think is very important and why I think it's very understood, is sexism. Sexism is a prejudice or discrimination based on one's sex or gender. Sexism can affect anyone, but particularly affects women and girls. It has been linked to gender roles and stereotypes and may include the belief that one sex or gender is intrinsically superior to another. Extreme sexism may foster sexual harassment, rape and other forms of sexual violence. Discrimination in this context is defined as a discrimination towards people based on their gender identity or their gender or sex differences. An example of this can be happening in the workplace inequality. Sexism refers to a violation of equal opportunities, formerly equality, based on gender, or refers to a violation of equality of outcomes based on gender. And sexism may arise from social or cultural customs and norms. So, the idea of the term sexism was only coined in 1965, but obviously we understand sexism happened in many societies, and it is also related to caste, class, race, ethnicity, and sex. So, when we look at these people, the history of this is, in the pre-agricultural world, evidence is likely to support the idea that many pre-agricultural afforded women a higher status than women today. Likeliness is, actually, women would look after the children at home. They would be the housewives or the child upbringers, or the rearers they used to call them, and men would be the breadwinners, right? And historians are reasonably sure that women had a roughly equal social power to men in such societies. Again, there's no support of this. I would probably say that actually they wouldn't have had the opportunity to buy land, so forth. They didn't have that opportunity, but they would have probably been more educated or would have taught certain things. Now, ancient civilizations is quite different. So within this, one gender was inferior to the other was established. So mostly, if you think about it, we think of kings, we think of kingdom, right? Queens were very much not so much in history. We also look at the way of voting, decision making, so forth. Now, the status of women in ancient Egypt depended on their fathers or husbands, but they had property rights and could attend court, including as plaintiffs. Examples in unequal treatment of women in the ancient world included written laws preventing women from participating in the political process. Voting. Now, it's going to be important when we talk about suffragettes in England years later, hundreds and hundreds of years later. So, for example, women in ancient Rome could not vote or hold political office. Another example is scholarly texts that indoctrinate children in female authority. It was women in ancient China were taught the Confucian principles that a woman should obey her father in childhood, husband in marriage, and son in widowhood. On the other hand, women of the Anglo-Saxon era were commonly afforded equal status. Now, another thing as well, in Indian culture, women were actually seen as equal. They would have Rajas who were the men, but also women as well could be leaders or rulers. So it was actually, the equality there was a bit more than actually some ancient cultures. Now, probably one of the most important things in sexism and the idea of what we consider women and the uses of the word bitch, which is actually really from a descendant from the word witch. Now, I'm going to be talking at the end of the month to link to Hollywood about the origins of witches and where that's all come from. So I'm going to go more into detail and you can watch that video. However, and it is already on YouTube, but I'm going to relaunch it with clips. So I'm going to explain about the witch hunts and trials because I think this is important about the idea of sexism and where a lot of ideas come from. So sexism may have been the impetus and fueled the witch trials between the 15th and 18th centuries. In early modern Europe and in European colonies in North America, claims were made that witches were a threat to the Christian ideal. Misogyny of the period played a role in the persecution of these women. So women were actually persecuted a lot in that time because they were seen that they were against Christianity and the Catholic Church. However, most of the priests actually used to get advice from women who were sometimes oracles and so forth. They did this in Egypt as well, and India as well. Women who seemed to have more intuition, saw the way how battles would become and so forth. But once they felt that was threatening the status quo, they changed it and then made this whole absolute rubbish about women were if a woman had a cat, if a woman wasn't married, if a woman wasn't these things, and they literally persecuted women who were single. If you were a single woman in them times, it wasn't very great for you. And the idea of also when they persecute witches, they would actually drown them, and if they didn't drown, they were a witch. Most people, if you were drowned, would die. So there was some really weird ideas. Then people were burnt at the stake. So when people talk about, the idea of religion isn't persecuting, and the medieval times, they burnt people because they didn't agree with and they were seen as heretics. So now witchcraft also remains illegal in several countries, including Saudi Arabia, where it's actually punishable by death. In 2011, a woman was beheaded in that country for witchcraft and sorcery. Murders of women after being accused of witchcraft remain common in some parts of the world. For example, in Tanzania, about 500 elderly women are murdered each year following such accusations. When women are targeted with accusations of witchcraft or subsequent violence, it's often the case that several forms of discrimination interact. For example, discrimination based on gender with discrimination based on caste. So this is the case in India and Nepal and even Pakistan. There's been issues with that. Now, what's interesting is that in India, when the actual colonisation happened, that is when women were a lot more persecuted. Whereas actually before, if we look at Indian history, most women would have nothing on the top. They were bare-breasted. They were seen as equals. They were treated very highly respected. Even in their culture, Hinduism, they actually goddesses and gods are treated about the same level. So it's very interesting how that's occurred, where the colonisation and also academic ideal has changed that. Now, what a big thing is with also marriage regulations. So, for example, restrictions on married women's rights were common in Western countries until a few decades ago. So, for example, French married women obtained the right to work for their husband's position in 1965. So this is only 60 years ago that women were allowed to work if their husband said they were allowed to. Absolutely crazy to think this happened. In fact, in the US, until 1875, women were not actually defined as people. That's just kind of mad, isn't it? Unless they were married. In West Germany, they retained the right in 1977 that if they're by their husband's position, they could go out to work. During the Franco era in Spain, a married woman required her husband's consent for employment, ownership of property and travelling away from home. And this was abolished in 1975. In Australia, until 1983, a married woman's passport application had to be authorised by her husband. So again, if you're not married, you're not with someone, you couldn't get a passport. Crazy ideas. This is what people did. And still, in some parts of the world, continue to lose their legal rights in marriage. For example, Yemenis marriage regulations say their wife must obey her husband and must not leave home without his permission. In Iraq, the law allows husbands to legally punish their wives. In the Congo, family code states that the husband is the head of the household, the wife owes her obedience to the husband. And the wife has to live with her husband wherever he chooses to live. And the wives must have their husband's authorization to bring a case in court or legal proceedings. So then it's also discrimination against women in marriage often resulted in financial payments such as dowry, bride price and dower. These are also things in transaction serve as legitimized and coercive control. So this goes on in a lot of countries still. There's still a lot of things with human rights and so forth from after the UN. It's supposed to be that women are treated better treated equally than men. It's again not true. In addition, many former British colonies, including India, maintain the concept of restitution of conjugal rights, under which a woman may be ordered by court to return to her husband. If she fails to do, she may be held in contempt of court. So again, women are frequently treated as property and then sold into marriage, into trafficking, into sexual slavery. Violence against women frequently takes the form of sexual violence. Victims of such violence are often accused of promiscuity and held responsible for their fate, while infertile women are rejected by husbands, families and communities. So the idea of infertile women and people are getting married to that, and then they find out their wife is infertile, their girlfriend's infertile, can actually cause a huge problem inside. They could be shunned. And this is why the idea of fertility issues and IVF and all this stuff can still be seen with shameful ideals because of this idea of women being the property of men. It is changing, but in some countries it still isn't. It's still a bit primitive in that respect. So who really was the people who actually changed the idea of voting for women? Well, that's a thing called the suffragettes. So the women's suffrages was not achieved until 1893, when New Zealand was the first country to grant women the right to vote. Saudi Arabia is the most recent country as of 2015 to extend the right to vote to women in 2011. Some Western countries allowed women the right to vote only relatively recently. So Swiss women only gained the right to vote in 1971, and then French women were granted to vote in 1944, Greece was in 1952, and so forth. Now, studies have shown that several democracies, including Australia, Canada, and the USA, women are still represented using gender stereotypes in the press. So this is again about ideas of these problems. Now, there was also an issue until the early 80s. Some high-end restaurants had two menus, a regular menu with the prices listed for men and a second for women, which did not have the prices listed. It was called the ladies menu. So the female diner would not know the prices of the items. So again, there was all these sort of things going on, and this also happened even in America. Then we got the gender stereotypes. So the gender stereotypes is in our language, how we use that. So sexism language is this, which language devalues the member of a certain gender. So also in our operation of the language is of the male as norm. So example, using generic masculine terms to reference a group of mixed genders such as mankind, man, guys or officers and men. Using the single masculine pronoun he, his or him, and then terms ending in man that may be performed by those of non-male genders such as businessman, chairman or policeman. So again, these sort of our language is still there, like the idea of human is the hue is actually about our race, so hue of the colour of our skin and man being mankind. So what we're trying to do now is going to away from sexist language and going to gender neutral language. Now this is through various 20th century feminist movements, from liberal feminism, radical feminism to postmodern feminism and queer theory. So all these things, however, is the fact that the English language is not inherently sexist in its linguistic system. By the way it's used, becomes sexist and gender neutral language can thus be employed. However, when we're looking at languages in Europe, say Spanish, they have the masculine and the feminine language. So for example, when they say a coche, el coche is the car, is masculine car, right? So there's things like this is where we have to work. So if like a casino, which is also seen, or piscina is a pool. So a piscina, because it's got the A, is a feminine thing. So a pool is seen as a feminine. It's really interesting how that works. So that's why actually the idea of where non-binary doesn't actually work, because in non-binary situations, in Spain it's non-binario, which is non-binary male, non-binaria is female. So it's still not binary, it's still binary. These are sort of things where we have to work with that and also understand this. So sexism in languages other than the English, so romantic languages such as French and Spanish may be seen as reinforcing sexism. Again, because the masculine form is the default word. German speakers have also raised questions about sexism interacting sex with grammar. Again, you've got to remember English is also a lot of Latin and German mixed together. Now in Chinese language, some writers point to sexism inherent in the structure of written characters. So then we also look at occupational sexism. So occupational sexism refers to discriminatory practice, statements or actions based on a person's sex occurring in the workplace. So this is that they found that most female employment rates have expanded and gender employment and wage gaps have narrowed, but still the gaps in wages is different. And a lot of that is also due to the idea of a lot of companies think, well, if we employ a woman, they could get pregnant. So if they're going to get pregnant, then they're going to have to take time off for having a child. There's all these stereotypes still are going through people's heads. And again, it's just not true. People are very much different. And some people, there'll be people who are men who say, well, actually, I'll look after the child and they don't go to work anymore, and the wife will still be the career winner. The breadwinner idea of that, even that idea, the breadwinner was always seen as a masculine role. And that's probably where changes have happened, where maybe men feel so much more emasculated. I'm not saying it's true, but it is very much something we have to look at when we're looking at the idea of sexism. Anyway, women who enter predominantly male work groups can experience the negative consequences of tokenism, performance pressures. Tokenism can be used to confound our sexism, to preserve male workers' advantage in the workplace. Also, if women do go up in a company, there's always this insinuation that they've done sexual favours to get up to a position and so forth. There still is this. It's not as bad as it was, but it was still, even when I was in offices years ago, I've definitely worked in office for many years, I've been many a teacher in the last so many years, apart from a holistic therapist. And most of my clients are actually female, so that's a kind of interesting dynamic. So to carry on with sexism, another couple of topics within this is objectification. So in objectification, in social philosophy, objectification is the act of treating a person as an object or a thing. Objectification plays a central role in feminist theory, especially sexual objectification. So within this, there is the philosophers and different things, and there's actually different versions of this. So I'm going to talk about a few of them. So instrumentality is treating the object as a tool for another's purposes. The objectifier treats the object as a tool of his or her purposes. Number 2 is denial of autonomy, treating the object as lacking in autonomy or self-determination. The objectifier treats the object as lacking autonomy and self-determination. Inertness, treating the object as lacking in agency or activity. And the objectifier treats the object as lacking agency and perhaps also in activity. Fungibility, treating the object as interchangeable with other objects. The objectifier treats the object as interchangeable with other objects of the same type or the objects of other types. Violability, treating the object as lacking in boundary, integrity and violable. The objector treats the object as lacking in boundary integrity. Ownership, treating the object as it can be owned, bought or sold. Now this will work into the next subject, into racism, the way people think and have these racist attitudes. The objectifier treats the object as subject, that is something that is owned by another, can be bought or sold. Denial or subjectivity, treating the object as there's no need for concern for its experience or feelings. So within this, and then you also go into this of the idea of Ray Helen Langton in about philosophical essays on pornography and objectification, and it's the idea of reduction to body, the treatment of a person identified by their body or body parts, reduction to appearance, treatment of a person presumably in terms of how they look or how they appear to the senses, silencing, the treatment of a person if they are silent, lacking the capacity to speak. And then within this, we then get another part of sexual objectification is in advertising. So in the 50s days, as most things were stereotypical roles, housewife was the breadwinner. In modern advertising, they are no longer confined to these traditional roles. However, advertising today still stereotypes men and women alike in a more subtle way, including by sexually objectifying them. This is just people what they believe. So, for example, in advertising, when men they are often shorter and put in background of images, shown in more feminine poses and generally present at a high degree of body display. Today, some countries, for example Norway and Denmark, have laws against sexual objectivity in advertising. Nudity is not banned, and nude people can be used to advertise a product if they're relevant to the product. Now, with another thing about sexism is the idea, again, the pornography idea, is contributes to sexism by objectifying women and portraying them in submissive roles. This also then goes into the idea of eroticism as well and exoticism. So eroticism is, we define the pornography as a graphically sexual explicit sublimation of women through pictures and words, and this is by women are dehumanised as sexual objects, things or commodities, or they're presented as sexual objects who enjoy humiliation or pain, presented as sexual object experience sexual pleasure in rape, incest or other sexual assault. Women are presented as sexual objects tied up, cut up or mutilated or bruised or physically hurt, and there's even more with this. So within this we get into these other ideas of that. Prostitution is another sexism issue. It's the business of practice of engaging in sexual relations for payment. And the media portrayals, which is hopefully is getting better, but then this is also goes into other issues of what we look at in attractiveness. For example, the idea is that many in ethnic minority groups is the idea of most of their objects are overly sexual, and ideas image of light-skinned, thinner people. So again, this this idea of eroticism again. And this is the idea of how all these things, sexist jokes, which we've done, and then gender identity discrimination is another form of sexism, which is now more prevalent and more, again, working towards that. Working towards stopping it, So again, with all these things of sexism, there's a lot more. We can go into sexism about child and forced marriages, which is still in some cultures. And then also in the military as well is the idea of what people think is male or female roles. Domestic violence, which seems to be a big problem with also the idea of rape as well, is that actually 1 out of 30 cases usually only go to trial for rape. Most women are not believed. It is changing, and that's the idea of the Me Too movement and so forth. But again, I was talking about the Me Too movement within the racism context of talking. And education as well is how the actual stereotyping of things are actually done within that. Fashion, again, very much if you think about fashion models, the idea of what that is, and also goes into art as well. And probably one of the things which is in some countries still is female genital mutilation, which is very common as well. And still in some countries they still believe in that. Legal justice and regulations has changed for certain things of how people are treated, and reproduction rights, and then sexual assault and treatment of victims. So sexism goes into a bigger, it goes into femicide, feminism and more, but I just wanted to talk about that as a discrimination, and then the idea of that is how, and then work on the next subject we're talking about is racism, and then how racism topped with classism, topped with sexism, then actually causes more discrimination. And we're going to talk about that now.